So I've been a user of Next.js for about 3 years now. I started using it in 2021 and really haven't picked up much else when building projects. There's a couple of reasons for that, and today I want to talk about why I use Next.js and why I will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So, as a solo developer, there's two things that are really important to me when I'm building applications, and that is speed and flexibility, right? So, Next gives me both of those. I can build something very quickly in it, and I have a lot of options to do so. For example, authentication. I could use NextAuth, which is what I usually use, but I've also started playing with Lucia Auth, which is a bit newer, and I've had a nice time with it. I have the option to use either in my project depending on what I'm trying to do. If I wanted to use something else, I have that option as well. For example, I recently just did an integration with AWS Cognito using email password authentication with NextAuth as kind of a wrapper in terms of doing the credential authentication bit. But if I wanted to, I could have gone raw cognito. I could have dropped something like Clerk and let Clerk done all my user management. So that could be seen as a negative where a framework like .NET or Laravel will have authentication built in. Having all of these different options in not just the Next world, but the Node world are super important for me because I can pick the right tool for the job. Dude, what? I have acquired a cat. Say hello to YouTube, Muffin. Okay, goodbye. So, another reason I like to use Next.js as my framework for building apps is I can just use JSX and React. So, kind of a little bit of a bias here. I've probably used React the most out of all of the major players in the front end space, and it's the one it's just simply the one I have the most experience with and the one I'm most comfortable with. With that being said, I have done projects in Angular and I have done projects in Vue, and none of them were as enjoyable to me as just being able to write React and JSX. There was something about the way that you do the templating and you have to learn special syntax to do loops and conditionals that I just didn't like. That was not for me. With JSX, I am just writing JavaScript, and that is so awesome because it's just less I have to keep in my head. So another big reason I like using Next.js is I have a unified code base. And what I mean by that is my back end and front end are in a single application, not two different applications. They are in a single application, right? So what I can do now is I can have traditional REST API endpoints for fetching my data, and I can do that with either route handlers or API routes if I'm using the Pages router, which is very rare now. I'm mostly on App Router. So that's more of like a traditional setup for most applications. But we also now have server components, and server components are awesome. Once I got used to the mental model of working with them and started actually shipping apps with them, it's been incredible. The amount it has simplified the amount that I have to do to actually get an app out is incredible. The fact that I can have what is essentially a cross and type safe way of doing things between my back end and front end is amazing. Being able to just fetch data on the server and stream the HTML back is chef's kiss. It is wonderful. So, server components, still new, still kind of finicky sometimes, are awesome and let me move very, very fast. Now, if I wanted to, I could also introduce something like TRPC, right? And get, kind of similar to, traditional APIs, but I can get full type safety on my client. So again, I get this speed and I get this flexibility when I'm actually working on my applications. On top of that, there's no need to maintain a whole different server, right? So API routes, for example, when you deploy to Vercel, are just serverless functions that they deploy for you. I don't have to manage an Express app. I don't have to manage a .NET app or whatever for my backend, and something completely separate for my front end. And again, this is super, super, super valuable to me as somebody who does a lot of applications on their own, somebody who uses Next for all of my freelance work. Having this kind of flexibility is awesome. It lets me move and ship features that my customers and my clients actually care about at the end of the day, as opposed to fighting with infrastructure, trying to manage multiple code bases, trying to figure out ways to get them to play nicely with each other. It's just stuff I don't have to think about, and I can instead just focus on actually building apps. Speaking of flexibility, let's take a step aside from Next itself and talk about Vercel. And Vercel can be kind of a hot topic sometimes on Twitter because it can be very hard to deploy Next to other environments besides Vercel. And I recently learned this the hard way, having to deploy a Next application to AWS for reasons I'm not going to talk about here, but that I couldn't use Vercel for. That being said, I still really like using Vercel's platform. It is cheap with an asterisk because it can rack up. If you're getting hit a lot, that bill can rack up. But for me, I pay $30 a month for the Pro plan, and I get to put all of my apps on there, whether they are single applications or whether they are in mono repos, and it just works. I don't have to think about pipelines. I don't have to think about setting up my own infrastructure. I don't have to deploy my own infrastructure. It just works. And that, to me, is absolutely incredible. Again, my biggest things are speed and flexibility. Having Vercel take care of all of those things for me gives me speed to get things out faster, right? So yeah, Vercel, if you're paying for the Pro plan, to me, it's pretty cheap, and you get a lot with it, and it completely removes the need to manage your own infrastructure. That being said, what else is there aside from Vercel? Well, I have deployed Next apps to Netlify, and that was fine. It was a pretty okay experience. It wasn't as great as it was in Vercel, but it was up and it was working and it was in production. What I've been using recently, and especially for this app I just deployed, is SST. And SST will build your next project for you using OpenNext and publish it to AWS. And that, to me, was a huge breath of fresh air, as I didn't want to have to build and deploy this thing on my own. It was kind of a tricky setup with trying to Dockerize it due to it being in a mono repo. But with SST, I just set up my configuration, pointed it at where the root of my app was, and it picked up everything it needed to, deployed all the infrastructure I needed, including S3 storage, authentication with Cognito, and my database, which is Postgres, and it just worked. It did all of the SSL certificates for me. It set up routing for me. It's really a nice solution if you don't want to use Vercel. And I personally am glad it exists. I think, maybe Next could be easier to build and maybe a little bit easier to host elsewhere. Vercel does give you some goodies with hosting on their platform, right? You get edge access. So, that could be better, but SST is a great alternative for the time being. Finally, and probably my biggest reason for using Next, is familiarity. So again, I have been using Next as my go-to framework for over 3 years now. I started with Pages Router, eventually flipped to Pages with TRPC, and now I'm using App Router for most things, but it's still the framework that I am the most comfortable with building in. I recently did an app with a .NET backend and Remix as the front end. And I wrote a whole blog post on that, my experience with going from Next to Remix, and there are things in Remix that I do genuinely like. I still found myself preferring the way Next does things, and even with having to shift mental models from Pages to App Router, I still felt like I could build something faster using the App Router than trying to pick up Remix. It's just the way things are set up are different, and trying to figure out the preferred way of doing things with it, that takes time away from being able to actually build. So using the same technology for 3 years, you get good with it. I don't want to say I'm good with it, but you're a lot faster in being able to build an application with it. So makes you faster. It's simply having less overhead, because again, these are all patterns and paradigms that Next has that I know and have worked with for years. I can just use it and be productive almost immediately with it. Where, again, even going to something like Remix takes a little bit of time to learn how Remix wants things done. Or if I went total 180 and went to something like Nuxt or SvelteKit or whatever, that's a real steep learning curve where, I have to learn this new tech, this new framework, as opposed to just being able to start building and shipping features that, actually make up what I'm trying to build, right? So, I'm at the point now where it just makes more sense for me to use Next to build things because of that familiarity, as opposed to trying to pick up and learn something new. So just to quickly recap, Next.js gives me a ton of flexibility when it comes to building my applications. I can build things very quickly in it, given that I've been using it for a long time. And it really simplifies the amount of work that I have to do as the developer to get a project out the door. Vercel makes it very easy to host, and I have a number of different options otherwise, should I choose not to host on there. So for me, it makes the most sense to just use Next to build my applications. So that's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a like, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe. I'm curious to know if you use Next.js for your projects, and if you don't, what else you're using instead and why. I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments below. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.